For the animation, I think it would be nice if we used a kind of wipe to bring all the pieces on, and then what I'd like to happen is use dynamics so that it slowly breaks up, and then as the camera flies through it kind of breaks apart and we fly through a hole. So there's a couple of different methods that we can use. We can use some effectors to wipe it on, and then we can use dynamics to kind of create the breakup. So the first thing we're going to do is add in the wipe, and we're going to do this simply using a plane effector. If we select our two cloners, come to the MoGraph menu, effector, and add in a plane effector. Now the plane effector by default is set to move the position, so let's just uncheck this. And what I'd like to do first of all is scale all of my pieces down. So if we select scale and then enable uniform scale, and let's set this to -1. Now what's going to happen now is all of the pieces are going to disappear, and the reason for that is because our plane effector is affecting all of the pieces. What we'd like to do is kind of localize that effect, and we can do that by simply using the built-in fall off of the effector. If we switch to the fall off tab, you can see at the moment it's set to infinite shape. Now we want to choose another shape so that areas within that fall off are affected by the effector, and clones that are outside of that shape aren't affected. And the shape that we're going to use for this is linear. So in other words, on one side of it we're going to be affected and on the other side we're not. And through the transition that we set here, the kind of clones will interpolate between being affected and not being affected. Now I'm going to set the orientation to be +X, and as soon as we do that you can see that what happens, our plane effector turns around along the X-axis, and all of the clones on this side aren't scaled down, and all of the ones on this side are. And if we grab this and move it across, you can see that they scale up as we move it across. Now if you're using an earlier version of Cinema 4D, you may not have this orientation option, in which case the orientation will be along Z and you can't change it. That was a feature that was added a little bit later on. So all you need to do is just rotate your effector 90 degrees and then you should be fine. Now I'm going to set the size along X to be a little bit larger, just so that the transition area is a little bit bigger. And you can choose any value you like here, and I'm going to just set that to something like 250. And we can also adjust the fall off, whether it's kind of 100% or there's no fall off. So let's set that to 100%. You can see now we have a bit more of a wider transition area. I'd also like the pieces to rotate into position, so I'm going to enable rotation. And I'm going to set the rotation bank to be 90. So as they scale up, they also twist into place. And then finally I'm going to enable position again, but this time I'm going to set Y to 0. And I want them to move on Z, so I'm going to set this pretty high at -3000. So what will happen is as we move our effector through, you can see they twist and fall into place. So they'll be coming almost from behind the camera and zooming into position. Now at the moment you can see that it's all happening very regular, and it'd be nice if we could break that up so they didn't all come in one row at a time exactly even. So it's a little bit more random. And the way that we can do that is we can actually randomize the internal weight of all of our clones, and we can simply do that with a random effector. Before we do that, however, let's organize our scene a little bit. I'm going to come up and just choose create null, and I'm going to call this null effectors, and then I'm going to drag and drop my effectors in here. I'm just going to take this and drop it to the bottom of the object manager. We can also use layers, and we can add our elements to layers, and that's something that I strongly advise when you're working with large complex projects, because it will help to organize the scene as you go. In this example I'm not going to use them because just for the sake of time I'm trying to fit everything in. Also need to name all our objects, so we call this puzzle wipe. Now if we select our cloners we switch to the effectors tab, you can see that at the moment we have our shader visibility, so that shader effector is controlling the visibility. We then have our plane effector creating the wipe. Now what we need to do is randomize the weight of our clones, and we need to do that before we do the wipe with the plane effector. If we come to the transform tab of these cloner objects, at the moment display is set to none. If we come down, we can set that to weight, and you can see in the editor we now have like a red dot for each of our clones. If we switch to the front view, you can see that quite clearly. So what that means is they're all weighted exactly the same, and the weights in MoGraph work in a very similar way to things like weights in a vertex map, which control how much a deformer will affect them. Well, basically the weights here control how much the effector will affect them. So if we set the weight of something much lower than another one, then it won't be affected by the effector. The easiest way to understand this is just to do it. So if we select both of these cloners, come to the MoGraph menu, come to the effectors, and add in a random effector. Now at the moment the random effector is set to randomize the position, so we just need to uncheck this. If we come down to the other parameters, you can see here we have one for weight transform. So what we want to do is we want to transform the weight, and if we drag this, you can see that as I do this, you can see that the colors of our weight change. Now we've got a bit of a problem here because we are using this method to build our jigsaw puzzle, so all of these are basically it's set the weight along this row, and that's been repeated all the way up, so we need to use a different random mode. So if we set the random to be noise instead, using global space, and if we set the animation speed to be 0 because we don't actually want to animate that, you can't really see the weight difference too much there, but there is. These ones are a little bit oranger and these ones are a bit more red. We could of course increase the weight transform like so, and you can see the difference quite clearly now. If you don't want to do that, another way of doing it is to adjust the minimum and max, and we can set the min to be 0 and the max to be 100. However, to be honest, the most efficient way of using it isn't necessarily to look at the colors in this example that we're creating. It's probably best to just look at the result, and if you look at the result right now, as we drag our plane effector through, you can see that it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Now the reason for this is because our random effector, let's just call this random weight and drag it down. If we select our cloners and look at the effectors list, the random weight is happening after the plane effector, and if we want this to randomize the weight to affect how the plane effector is evaluated, we need to put that random effector before the plane effector in the effectors list. So if we simply just drag that up, you can see immediately we have a result. Well, we have a result in one of our cloners, so we need to make sure that we just do that on both of them. Now if we drag our plane effector through, you can see that we're getting a much more of a random wipe. And you can come here to a sort of halfway position and select your random effector, and you can then adjust your minimum and maximum, or adjust your weight transform until you get a result you're happy with. So if we set the weight transform really high, you can see that now the wipe is like not even a wipe anymore, it's kind of happening over the surface of the whole cloner. So I'm going to set that back to 100, and I'm going to leave the minimum and maximum at 100 and minus 100. I'm quite happy with that result, but I'd encourage you to play with that so you can see how adjusting that weight can affect how the other effectors work. Now of course that's adjusted the weight of your clones from there on, so you can always add in another effector later on and set the weight transform to 100, but without using a random effector, using like a shader effector, so that they all become the same weight again. So sometimes you might want to reset that weight later on. But that gives you an idea of how you can use weighting when you're working with MoGraph and effectors. I'm just going to select these cloners and switch to transform, just switch the display to none so we don't see the dots in the view. It's a good idea to probably save your project at this point if you haven't done so, and then we can kind of set up our camera move as we travel through the jigsaw puzzle. For the camera animation, I'd like the camera to start a little bit further back, kind of zoom forward as the jigsaw puzzle appears, and then slow down, travel forward, and then finally accelerate through the puzzle itself. I always find when animating that it's a good practice to sort of use as few keys as possible to achieve the result that you want, because you can fine-tune a lot of it using the F-curves, and the more keys you have, the more difficult that can become. And this is going to be a really simple animation, so we're only going to use a few keys, but when you're making much more complex animations, you'll then sort of appreciate the fewer keys, the easier it is to manipulate. Let's add in a camera, and I'm going to switch to coordinates. I'm actually just going to reset the X and Y, and I'm going to reset the rotation values. And if we just make this the active camera so we can see the result, let's select our camera and set the Z value to be -8000. So it's quite a long way back, and you can see here our puzzle is quite small, so we can start at this point and we can slowly kind of bring our jigsaw on as we accelerate forward, and then we gradually move towards it until it's almost full screen, and then at that point we zoom through it. At this point I'm going to switch over to an animation layout. Just let me resize that so that it fits within the capture area. So I normally use my own layouts for this, but I'm using the layouts that Maxon supplies you, so you should be able to follow along nice and easily. If we select our camera and come to the coordinates tab, let's make sure we're on frame 0, and let's just control click on the small circle next to the position Z value. This will add a key for us, and here we can see that key has been added. Now I'm going to just jump to the very end. In fact, let's come to the frame and choose frame project settings, just so we can see the whole of our document within the timeline. So we're on frame 124, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the camera to be 2000 and then add in another key. If we select the camera and then press Control and hit space while we're in the timeline, this will switch us over to F-curves, but because we held down Control, hitting space, it will leave the object that we have, or the keys that we have selected, and it will bring those to be the selected keys in our F-curve view. Now what I'd like to do here is actually reverse what's going on. So I'm just going to select the very first key here, and I'm going to grab this handle and just pull it up like so, so that we kind of accelerate out of that key. And then I'm going to do the same with the end key and just pull this down. So what we're essentially doing here is we're kind of accelerating out of this key, and then we're going to sort of slow down the move, and then at the end we accelerate into this key. And this gives us the kind of move that we want, but hopefully only with 2 keys. And you can see the motion that's going on there. If we just press play, you can see what happens. So that's kind of the effect that I'm after. I'm sure you guys can spend a little bit more time fine-tuning this curve. I'm just going to make that acceleration a bit more and try and make the middle section a little bit slower. So it's almost flattening out here. So we could add another key in the middle and use that to flatten that out if needed, but I don't really think we need that, to be honest. You can see what's happening there. So at this point here, we really want the jigsaw to kind of be assembled, and then at this point here we want it to start breaking up. And for these middle frames, we want the whole thing to be kind of together, so it's coherent. Another thing we could do, just to add a little bit more action to the camera, is we could add some banking. So let's come to the camera, switch to the coordinates tab, and let's add in some rotation values. And I'm going to use a rotation value of, say, -20, -25, so that everything's tilted. Add in a key, jump to the end, and let's set that to be 25, and add in another key. And if we fold the camera down and select our rotation, press H to frame that curve, you can see that we have a kind of auto tangent, so it's doing an ease, and most of the turn is happening here. Well, we probably want the turn to happen in a very similar way to our position, so I'm literally going to create the same kind of curve. I'm just going to bring this one like so, select this end key and bring this handle down like so. And we want to make sure that when we're at the beginning that our camera is more or less level. So at this point here we want the curve to be sitting along the 0 line. But because we've only used 2 keys here, it's going to be nice and fluid and everything's going to keep moving all the time. And there you go, and you can see the result of that. It's almost a bit too flat there. I think we could probably pull this one down and pull this one up, just so we keep that motion going a little bit more obvious. And there we go. Really nice and simple. But for a move like this, that's probably all you need. And if you were creating a sequence of these, imagine it was a title sequence or something, you could then zoom through this and you could appear with another jigsaw puzzle. Okay, so now we've blocked out our camera move, we can come and add the wipe to actually bring the jigsaw puzzle into view. To do that, we simply need to animate the position of our plane puzzle wipe object, and if we grab this and pull it across until we don't see any puzzle pieces, so somewhere around here, let's just round that up and say 1000, and on frame 0 I'm going to add a key for this. Now I'd like the wipe to be fairly quick, but not so quick that we don't actually see it, so maybe 25-30 frames long. So I'm going to go to frame 30 and I'm just going to drag this across. I'm going to hold shift so we just stay on whole numbers and wait until that last piece just lands in place. So we're looking at -850 on X, and I'm going to add another key. So now if we come back, you can see that as we zoom forward, the jigsaw is built. Now one thing with the plane effector animation is that I have my keys set to auto tangent, so if we select the plane puzzle wipe, select the position and press H to view the curve for that, you can see that it's easing out of this first key and into the last key. So if we just press Command A to select them all, and then we can set this to linear, and you can click on this icon here, or you can press Alt L and that will set that to linear. We don't really need to have any ease on that. We just want that to start moving straight away and to travel through in a nice linear fashion. So that looks cool. One thing we can do now we've set up that animation is we can select the plane effector, switch to the fall off tab, and we can just uncheck visible here, and that will just hide the fall off GUI in the editor. There's a kind of widget that shows up, just makes our editor view a little bit clearer. Now we could make this a little bit more interesting by adding in another effector after our plane effector, just so that as each piece lands in place we get a kind of springy effect going on. If we press play now, you can see that they kind of all land in place and then they just stop abruptly. If we select both of our cloners under the cloner puzzle object, come to the MoGraph menu, choose effector and add in a delay effector. I'm going to call this delay puzzle spring, if I could just spell correctly, and I'm going to just drag this and drop this into my list of effectors. Now by default the delay effector under the effectors tab is set to mode blend, so what that will do is it will blend between the positions or the rotation values etc that you've set or that you've controlled with your previous effector. And what I want them to do is have a kind of spring effect, so they just oscillate a small amount when they land in place. It will kind of give the piece a little bit of inertia, and you can overdo this effect, it's quite well known. But if we just use that kind of subtly, it will definitely add a little extra to our animation. Now by default the strength is set to 50. If I just whack this up to kind of 84, just press play, you're going to see the effect quite clearly, and you can see you get this really jelly like result. Now obviously that's has its uses. It's a little bit comedy in certain situations. That's a brilliant feature. I'm going to set this down a bit lower, probably around 40, so that the effect is much more subtle, so you hardly get to see it, but when you watch this played back, it just adds that little bit extra, a little bit of kind of secondary motion. You can switch to the parameter tab and you can actually transform position, scale or rotation independently. So if you don't want the springiness to affect the position, just the scale and rotation, then you can enable and disable the relevant parameters in there.